Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back all you Zoia fans for yet another little tutorial on the Empress Effects Zoia, the patchable modular digital synthesizer in a little box with a unique grid interface and where the only limitation is your imagination and the CPU, of course. Today's patch is one in the genre of selecting settings, or I like sometimes calling it also patches within patches. I made two videos, I think, if I remember correctly, about this before. I made one about radio buttons, very popular video, it turns out. And also I made one with just a basic scrolling through of patches or settings using the Stomp Switch. You could scroll through a certain number of settings, and you can also select them randomly with radio buttons. That's another video. I'll just put the link to that as well up here. This one uses a different principle. This one uses timing to select a patch or a setting. So what we got here on this page is the visual feedback page. Of course, it doesn't have to be this elaborate. It's nice to have a visual feedback. It doesn't have to be this fancy. It could just be a little square of a certain color, for instance. Yeah, but I chose colors and numbers to give a very strong visual feedback. And the flashing light down here is an indication of the speed at which the selection scrolls through. So I'll just show you how it works. So it is connected to the Stomp Switch. It could have been a push button on the grid, but I chose the Stomp Switch. And when I push this button, it starts scrolling through from 1 to 8. And when I release it, the number also goes over to the right here, and that is an indication of the active setting. So it doesn't change settings until you release the button. So you hold, you get to the right one, and you release it, and that is the one that is selected. So quite simple and easy. You can adjust the speed, you can make it go faster than this, but of course the faster it goes, the harder it will be to select the correct patch. If you want to. So let's just have a little look at the mechanics of this patch. Most of it is actually on this page here. I just realized I could have almost fitted in if I'd made it 7 settings instead of 8, but that's all right. I also have a little bit of stuff on the third page here. I'll get to that when I get to it. So first of all, we have a Stomp Switch CV output here. So that is the interface with this switch here. And that could have been a push button instead, but of course we chose to use the Stomp Switch, which is a common use case scenario, of course. If you use this as a stomp box and you want to get through different settings during your live set, for instance, and it is on the floor, this is a good way to do it. This Stomp Switch is, of course, momentary, which means that when you push it, it gives out a value of 1. When you release it, it gives a value of 0. And this is in turn connected to a multiplier. And the reason for that is, if you see here, our second module here is an LFO. This is the LFO that decides the speed at which this patch is cycling through the different setting parameters, or the different settings that you want to select between. So you can set this to different speeds if you like. Now it's a lot faster. Let's just see how that works now. It's still relatively easy to sort of see what's going on and make a good selection there at 278 beats per minute. I'm going to move it down again to 180-ish, which is what it was before. And the output from the LFO doesn't directly go to the parts of the patch that select between the patches. It goes into a multiplier. And so it goes into the first input of a multiplier. The second input is the Stomp Switch, which means that when the stomp switch is not pushed, that pad in the multiplier gets a 0 value, which means that there will be no output from the multiplier. The output will be 0. So only when the stomp switch is pushed and when the LFO is at its high setting, or it's its high value, only then will the signal go through the multiplier. So basically, when you push the stomp switch, the multiplier here becomes the LFO. When you release it, there is no LFO passing through, except to this dot here. That dot always gets the LFO. So the multiplier, let's just follow the signal path here, goes into the gate input of this 8-step sequencer, which means that when this button is pushed, this sequencer will start cycling through its steps. And this is the one that selects between the different settings. And the way it does that is by, and we can have a little look at the values in the step sequencer now, and we see step 1 is 0.1245, so almost 0.125. This one is a little bit below 0.25. A little bit below 0.375, 0.5, 625, 75, 875, and finally 1. And if you look at those numbers and you have watched any of my videos before, you will recognize that these are numbers that will allow you to select between different channels on an 8-channel switch. And that is exactly what these values are for. So the CV output from the sequencer goes to the channel selector on an out switch. What an out switch does is it takes a single input, in this case we've set it to a permanent 1, and based on the channel select value that comes into this pad, it will select between, or which of the, in this case, 8 outputs is the only one of the outputs that gets the signal through. So it's like a relay. And the channel selector here gets its value from the sequencer. And the way a channel selection works is it takes the value range from 0 to 1, divides it equally between the number of channels. So in this case, we have 8 channels, meaning that when this pad here, the channel selector, gets a value between 0 and 0.125, 125 of course, so we do take 1 and divide by 8, it will select channel 1. If it gets between 0.125 and 0.25, it selects channel 2, etc. So that means that these different values in the sequencer correspond perfectly to channels 1 through 8 on this switch. And, well, they don't have to be exactly the values I put in. What I usually do, because the lights on the Zoia give visual feedback as to what's going on, I like making the values as high as possible in the range that I'm using. It doesn't have to be. The first one could have been 0 if you wanted to. But if it's supposed to be between 0 and 0.125, I like putting it just a little bit below the maximum value, so I get as much light as possible out of the Zoia. You don't have to do that, but that's just the way I work. So, right, so now we have a switch, and whatever channel is active based on this sequencer is going to get a value output of 1. So all these pads here will get a value of 1. What are these connected up to? Well, they are connected up to a set of value modules here, and I've actually compressed them now, which I didn't need to do after I moved things around a bit. I'll just show you what these... now, one thing you can do when you're patching on the Zoia to save space is that you can move modules so that the outputs of them overlap with some other pads input or main sort of pad, and the reason is, of course, that they take up less space. Once you've patched them up, they take up less space, and also you won't accidentally patch them up with something. So these first 8 value modules are the ones now that correspond to those 8 switch settings. So if I just, yeah. And also there's a second set of patches here as well, or value modules rather, and I'll get to those in a moment, because we have, of course, 2 numbers here. One that is the active patch and one that is the selection patch. So just to show you what's happening now. So the sequencer runs through its 8 steps. The switch runs through its 8 steps. And let's see what happens on the other page. So now, as I can see, yes. Okay, so these bottom ones are the ones, I think I said it the other way around before. So these bottom ones are the ones that now are connected to the switch directly and change as you're holding down. So you can see these are cycling through. And you can see the first one is very faint there. And as I drop this, as I drop the switch, you see these value modules here then jump to whatever is the active one. And that's because these value modules are used for the active patch number. So just to show you now, the value output of these are as follows. Let's see. Yes, so this is the only active one, and the active one now has a value output of 0.2874, which corresponds to a color code of green on a UI button. So I'll just say a little bit about this display here. Now these dots on this display, there are 3 times 5 here and 3 times 5 here. They're all individual modules called UI buttons, user interface buttons. And one of the unique things about a user interface button is that depending on what value it gets, it will get a different color and a different intensity. So the way it is patched up is, let's just do channel 1 here. So if I have a look at so see channel 1 on the switch, which is connected, of course, to the number 1, and the first value module that creates the number 1, it gets a connection strength, has a connection strength of 3.75. The next one has a connection strength of 8.75, etc. They are different values. These numbers come from the user manual. Under the UI button section, it says which values correspond to the brightest color of a certain color, and these are the ones I've used. So 3.75 means bright red, 8.75 means bright orange, 18.75 really means bright yellow, etc. So it takes the value input of 1 and it turns it into 0.0375, 0.0875, 0.187 by the connection strength. I hope that is clear. And then let's just do the 1 now. Okay, and then the value module for 1, which is the one down here, now it's got a 0.0375 as its value because of the connection strength. It's like a percentage, a multiplication with a low value. And the output of that is connected to these pads here. So I've patched up the output of the value module for each number to the pads that make up the shape of that number. And I've done the same for all the 8 numbers. And I've also done it for the second set of value modules to this display here with those numbers. So that's just a visual feedback. It could have been connected to absolutely anything. It doesn't matter. One important thing to note now, because we are using this to change settings, of course, the values we get from these things can also be used to patch up other things, and that's the whole point of it, not just for the visual feedback of the numbers. Right, so that is the first number, which is the one that is being selected between. But what about the second one? So, and we see there's the active setting. We see there's another out switch down here, and it has, like the first one, it has an input of 1 and a channel selector here and outputs. Let's see, I'll just show you now. And these outputs have exactly the same values as the one in the first out switch. And this is because we are using them now to create the visual feedback of the number for the active setting. But important note, of course, if you're using this to actually change settings within the Zoia, this is the switch you would use to connect different settings to. So you have a value coming into the switch of 1, and you can send it to 8 different places, or that is to say you can send it to more than 8 places. But for each of your sets of values, each of your settings, you take the channels of this switch, and that's the one you patch up with whatever is going to change when you have that setting applied. So for instance, you want the first setting to change your reverb length to 4 seconds. Then you take this pad here, you patch it up with your reverb length pad on your reverb module, and then you adjust the connection strength to get exactly the right setting. And then you can do that as well for other things, all depending on what you want to use it for. It can be absolutely anything. You can take it and you can patch it up to an oscillator and change the frequency. You can patch it up to an ADSR and change the attack value. And you can do all of those things at the same time from one place. And that is here. This is basically the heart of the setting selector, is this switch right here. But this one is only used at the moment for creating the visual feedback of this second number, which is made the same way as the first number, by the connection strength defining a color and brightness of the UI buttons. Now, how does the second switch keep its value, and how does it only get it when you release the switch? That is the last part of the mechanics of this that need to be explained. Let's have a little look at the switch now. It's got a channel selector here that is connected to this sample and hold output. So sample and hold is, of course, a brilliant way to, or maybe sometimes it's the only way to actually create a variable that stays the same until it is changed. So in order for this sample and hold to be triggered, its only trigger input here is a comparator. And we want it to be triggered when we release the switch. So basically, you push down the switch, it cycles through the different values. And also, I'll just show you now, I didn't show properly. Let's see. So the sample and hold input now is, oops, sorry, that's the wrong one, comes from the sequencer output. So it also takes the CV value from this cycling sequencer, is always sent to the sample and hold, but because it only copies out to the output when it gets triggered, and the trigger is from the comparator. And the comparator, what a comparator does is It has two inputs known as the positive input and the negative input. And when the value in the positive input is higher or equal to the value in the negative input, it outputs a value of 1. So it's like an on-off switch that is adjusted by the values that are in these inputs. And the negative input of this module, let's see what happens now. If I push the stomp switch, the negative input gets the value of 1. If I release it, it gets the value of 0. So this is connected to the stomp switch module. And that means that when I push this switch, the negative input becomes 1 and it becomes greater than the positive input, which is set to 0.9994. And when this gets greater than the positive input, it outputs a value of 0. So basically what this means is that whenever I don't push the stomp switch, this comparator sends out a value of 1. When I push the stomp switch, it sends a value of 0. When I release it then, and it sends out a value of 1, this sample and hold is triggered, and it gets its input from the note value in the sequencer, which means it keeps that value as it is at that moment when you release the button, copies that over to the output, and that output is what is connected to the channel selector of the switch that controls what setting is active in the Zoia. So that is how it works. So it registers basically when the, when this is released is when it triggers, and not before. So when and there we go. Oops. So I think that is pretty much all that needs to be explained about this. It is a relatively simple patch, and of course you don't need the visual feedback, but I think it's quite nice to do it like that. And if you'd had 7 settings now, you could have fit them all into all the workings of it, apart from the value modules and the visual feedback, into one page. Because the value modules and this isn't technically part of the workings of it, it's just the visual feedback. So all the workings of this patch would fit into one page if you overlapped your output modules, or if you made it 7 settings big. And there you have it. And of course, if you want to make the selection go a bit faster, you can, maybe that's a bit ambitious. Let's try 360 beats per minute. Now, see how that looks. Still relatively easy to actually get the one you want-ish. So you set the speed to taste, I guess, depending on what you like doing. So there you have it. Nice little utility patch for you. Another way to select between settings inside the Zoia. And I hope you enjoyed that. If you did like this, please like, share, subscribe, join me on Patreon, all those things. If you found this useful, please leave a comment as well. And I guess I will put this on patch storage like I usually do these days with my patches. Of course, this one is a little bit fiddly to patch up the way I've done it because of the numbers. It takes a little bit of effort to set those up. And I will see you again next time I come up with something new I want to do on the Zoia, which is relatively often these days. So thanks again for watching, and goodbye for now. Bye-bye.